What would be helpful is if we give a few key concepts for each of the three worldviews, so that when we're referring to them as they answer these questions, we'll have an idea, we'll be able to identify a few key concepts with the worldviews, and we'll have a handle on each of them, hopefully. When we talk about the pre-modern or the classical worldview, I'd like us to think of the key words of order and harmony. Exquisite beauty, actually, but a kind of ordered whole, a fixity. Everyone and everything had its place. The world is an ordered whole. It fit together. And so, ideas and norms and values and truth, once these things are discovered, they are universal. They're universally applied. And from these universal ideals and norms and values, you can deduce, if you think logically and clearly enough, you can deduce all sorts of conclusions from them. Modernity, the modern worldview. There's really one word I'd like you to think of every time we mention the word modern. Reason. It's the primacy, the supremacy, really, of human reason that characterizes the modern world. And you remember I said that the modern world the modern worldview, really takes hold in the second half of the 17th century. And why do I identify that? Because it's the rise of the scientific method of science. And what accompanies this emphasis on reason is a profound confidence and optimism with what reason can achieve. Always think in terms of reason as exalted in modernity. It's the age of reason. Remember that phrase from your old college? It's the age of reason. It's the age of the Enlightenment. And so this confidence and enthusiasm and optimism over what reason can achieve leads to a sense that history is comprised of inevitable progress. Trust reason, and progress will come. And then what happened from this, trusting reason, 17th century, 18th century, 19th century, trusting reason. Wonderful things happened as a result of science. Wonderful advances in technology. But what also happened? The 20th century happened. The 20th century happened. Now, what's the one word I want you to keep in mind when we think of postmodernity, which we're identifying with the 20th century? The fact that there is no one word. No? That's very significant. One author likes to say, you can't speak of the postmodern worldview the way we're doing it today. It's kind of an illegitimate thing to do because there is no one world. In fact, they don't even like to use the term universe. They like to use multiverse. Which we'll see. You see? But what characterizes postmodernity as a mood is a sense of profound disillusionment and despair in the face of what we have experienced in the 20th century. And now I think you can say, well, isn't it true that the human race has always suffered much? The human race has always wrought havoc on one another in war and so forth. And the answer to that is yes, of course. However, modernity had promised so much. It had promised a far different world. And so the despair and disillusionment we experience in our lifetimes in the 20th century is really a consequence of the failure of modernity to deliver on its promises. We had to come to grips with that. The great rage within the last couple of years of the movie Titanic, it's a Broadway play and so forth, that was 1912, was it? Or 1912. What was that? That is a devastatingly symbolic image of modernity, the hubris of humankind and what reason could achieve, sinking to the depths of the ocean under the power of nature. Mind over nature. You see? It's interesting, I think, and that's why that sense of meaninglessness, people were laughing at Sandra Snyder's article, which she quite rightly indicates about postmodernity being a loss of meaning and reality isn't real. But that sense of meaninglessness attends us in the 20th century. It's a part of the lives, particularly of the young people with whom we deal in ministry. It's interesting that, and not surprising, that it's the artists among us that often see things emerging before the rest of us have a chance to understand what's happening. If you read some of the poetry of the first decades of the 20th century, for instance, you get a real sense of this. I'd like to share just one with you. It's entitled The Second Coming by William Butler Yeats. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Surely some revelation is at hand. Surely the second coming is at hand. The second coming. Hardly are those words out when a vast image of spiritus mundi troubles my sight. Somewhere in the sands of the desert, a shape with lion body and the head of a man, a gaze blank and pitiless as the sun, is moving its slow thighs, while all about it reel shadows of the indignant desert birds. The darkness drops again. But now I know that 20 centuries of stony sleep were vexed to nightmare by a rocking cradle. And what rough beast, its hour come round at last, slouches toward Bethlehem to be born? Yeats wrote that in 1920. Things fall apart, the center cannot hold. And the world had not yet seen Auschwitz and Hiroshima and El Salvador and Liberia and Sierra Leone and Bosnia, and the list could go on and on. This is our century. Let's try to plumb the depths of this, how we coexist within ourselves, marked as all of us are by this 20th century, and yet deeply rooted in pre-modernity, and sharing the confidence in science of modernity. Wouldn't you say that's true of most of us? Let's try to plumb the depths of that. To do it, we'll take each of the sets of questions, and we will try to indicate very briefly how each worldview answers them. Okay. In terms of the classical or the pre-modern worldview, the classical worldview is basically a philosophical worldview where every question was raised and answered in the context of one comprehensive discipline called philosophy. And the sciences were wedded to philosophy. You know how in our time we speak of physics and biology and psychology and so forth? You know? Well, they were all really under the umbrella of philosophy. And the interesting thing about it is that everything flowed, because philosophy was the umbrella, everything flowed from the question, what does it mean to live the good life? Meaning, of course, not the Hollywood good life, but what does it mean to live the human life? Everything, you could say, our classical pre-modern worldview flowed from the attempt to answer that question. All our Western culture classically comes out of the attempt to answer that question. What happens in the modern world, in modernity, is, I think a word you could use there is the scientific worldview. If you want to identify, in terms of a world picture, it's a scientific understanding of the universe and how it works. And I'm identifying this, of course, now with the emergence of the scientific method, where now all the individual sciences, physics, chemistry, biology, psychology, and eventually sociology, becomes independent of philosophy. They become studies on their own, don't they? But notice a few consequences of that. Some wonderful consequences of that is, now reason works its way on matter in physics and chemistry. It works its way on living things in biology, on the human psyche in psychology, on groups in sociology, and discovers all sorts of marvelous things. You can understand why modernity issued in this great excitement about what reason could achieve. It was achieving it before our very eyes. But making these disciplines independent of philosophy, they become what? Divorced from the ethical question. No longer is the ethical question the first question that is asked. What does it mean to live the good life? And then we consider inanimate world, the living world and our world in that context. Now, that's significant because, and here's a feature of modernity that's deeply rooted in us, I think, this rationality, this trust in science. We come to think that there's such a thing as pure objective science, value-free inquiry. That you come at an investigation, whether it be physical, chemical, psychological, sociological, whatever it is, you come at that investigation with no preconceived notions of your own, totally objective. See, we know in postmodernity there's no such thing as that anymore. Everybody brings something to an inquiry. But we trust in this scientific understanding of reason. Something's really, really true when it's objectively true. We're infected, if I could use that word, with that from modernity. Now notice what happens. In the pre-modern world, the philosophical world, there's a kind of vertical dualism. God is in his heaven, and we are here. You see? In the scientific worldview, there's a kind of horizontal dualism, where reason works its way on matter. Reason works its way on human things, you see? And what happens to God in modernity? No room for God. See? God is marginalized in the modern worldview because the whole thing is human reason and what human reason can achieve when it explores its experience. Another aspect of the scientific worldview, the Copernican revolution. What was that? What was the Copernican revolution? That's right. That it's not the Earth that's the center, a fixed, remember the ordered whole of the pre-modern world, but it's rather the Earth is moving around the sun. The Earth is rolling around the sun. And we call that the Copernican revolution. In fact, we use that now as a sort of a metaphor for other profound revolutions in thought. So-and-so is a Copernican revolution in music or art. It turned everything upside down. Now, we smile sometimes when we realize that it's only in the present pontificate of John Paul II that the Church finally vindicated Galileo. We smile at that. But why? Why did it take so long? What is the big deal about knowing that the Earth revolves around the sun? I mean, I'm sure nobody lost sleep over that last night. That the Earth revolves. What was the big deal that made it a Copernican revolution that brought Galileo in front of the Inquisition when his experiments verified Copernicus's theory? What was the big deal? Change the structure? What else? Yes? Change the view of the world, right? Exactly. Didn't fit neatly anymore, exactly. It changed to we're not the center. Us and God are not the center now. We're just one, or we're a normal, regular old planet. We're middle size. We're in the middle of we're just a normal planet rolling around the sun. Anything else? The church wouldn't be the center anymore. That's another very important thing. It's an interesting way to put it. It was a challenge to authority, right? And to the teaching. We're going to see how that plays itself out when we get to truth and value. But here's the point I want to make, very important. If you look at the pre-modern, the whole philosophical perspective, Aristotle, the Greek perspective that Thomas Aquinas used, For all of these centuries, that whole philosophical worldview was used to explain the faith, wasn't it? So much so that it became integrated with the Christian faith. The Greek philosophical worldview became integrated with the Christian faith. So that when that worldview is challenged, it seemed tantamount to challenging the Christian faith. You see, we might be more comfortable not feeling that, but you can imagine what it was and why it's taken us all these years to grapple with it. We're still grappling with this. The interconnection of the Greek philosophical system, so brilliantly used, for instance, by Aquinas in the High Middle Ages to explain the faith, was thought to be so integrally that how do you separate them? What is the faith and what's this Greek philosophical system is still our challenge. Let's look at postmodernity on world picture question. It's critical. And let me try to explain that in terms of world picture. If modernity means that there's no more up there God and us down here, no more up there, down there, what modernity means, what the Galilean, the Copernican revolution means, is there's only out there in many directions from the earth. That intensifies in the postmodern view of the picture of the universe. The example I like to give to help people grasp this was given by Chet Ramo, who's an astronomer in Massachusetts. And you might try this at lunchtime today. If you take a salt shaker and take out a grain of salt, 1 grain of salt, and put that grain of salt on your fingertip, and allow that to stand, that little grain of salt to stand for the sun, the star of our solar system, and consider these 2 facts. There are more stars in our galaxy than there are grains of salt in 10,000 1-pound boxes of salt. Secondly, there are more galaxies known to us today than there are boxes of salt in all the supermarkets in all the world. What do we conclude from this? It's very, very big. It's unimaginably big. For my students, I played this video from the Air and Space Museum in Washington called Cosmic Voyage, in which they have this beautifully simulated picture of an event that took billions of years to happen, which is the colliding of galaxies. It's a magnificently synthetically reproduced picture of the colliding of galaxies. And the astounding thing that the voiceover says is, as this is going on, you see this mix. It looks like this, you know, if you take glitter and just throw it up together, you know. And the voiceover says, now, of course, none of the stars actually collide with one another. The distances between them are so great. The distances between them are so great. It's so vast. It's too big, you see. But we're accustomed, I mean, we know about the Hubble telescope up there. We take this in on the evening news. It's our world picture, too. But wow, not only is there no more up there and down here, not only is it the fact that it's out there in all directions, but out there is enormously vast. And that's why I think critical is a good word to use for this. Because what it indicates to us is that we can't take anything on face value. Everything in our experience is moving, changing. Nothing is fixed so that we can know it absolutely. And so to have a critical viewpoint is not to have a viewpoint in the negative sense of using critical as finding fault or criticizing, but rather critical in the sense of conveying careful analysis. You know, the young people use the slang expression, where are you coming from? That's a critical worldview. You have to say, where are you in reference to everything else? Because where you are and where I am, neither place is absolute. We are both of us moving, and everything around us is moving and changing. To act as if I or someone else had an absolute perspective is to close myself off from what is most obvious in the postmodern picture of the world, namely the relativity of all things, the partiality of all things, of everything we know, of every perspective. Because what I see from where I stand in the midst of this vastness is partial and relative to where I stand. Obviously, we could go on, but let's move to the second set of questions. Now, we're only on the first set of questions. Already we're swimming in a sea of vastness, at least. What is important and true, and how do we know that? In the pre-modern world, truth corresponds to reality. It is known by looking. If you look carefully enough, you'll see truth, because it's there in the world. Now, a couple of things follow from this. Truth, therefore, is eternal and unchanging and absolute, because once you see it, once you recognize it, once you found it, there it is. And in our ordered universe, that truth is established then. Do you see? It's known by looking, so once you see it, there it is. Now and this is very important, that's why in the whole pre-modern classical world, the tradition is a source of authoritative knowledge. The tradition is a source of authoritative knowledge because what is it? It's the handing on of the true seeing of previous generations. There's no need for you to do it again because we did it. Do you see? So in that ordered whole, it makes all the sense in the world for the church facing Galileo and Copernicus to say, truth is truth, absolutely, unchangingly, and eternally. Do you see? And the tradition comes into modernity with this sense of itself as authoritative knowledge because it recognizes that truth, once it's seen, corresponds to the way it is, and therefore it's unchanging. That's very important for us to grasp. In the modern worldview, truth is historically conditioned. It's bounded by historical circumstances. Now, let me try to explain what I mean by that. You see that we're identifying modernity with the scientific worldview? Well, one of the sciences is the science of history, where human reason works its way on human history. And what is discovered when truth is known via the historical method is that each culture, each place, each time is bounded by a set of cultural, political, religious, linguistic realities that's not shared by another culture, place, or time. Let's give an example. Let's look at our two exquisite Annunciations. Both of these paintings on either side of the podium are entitled The Annunciation. This by Van Eyck is painted in 1435. And this by Tanner is painted in 1898. Two very different views of the Annunciation, aren't they? It's worth your while to take time to look with these. But the point I want to make about historical consciousness is this. When Van Eyck is portraying Mary, if you look at her, her face, her clothing, the way her hair is arranged, all of it is as a woman of his time, isn't it? Now, Van Eyck knows in 1436 that the Annunciation took place a very long time ago. That's not that the modernity discovered history. Modernity discovered historical consciousness. What Van Eyck was not so conscious of is that the first century in which Mary lived contained a whole different set of dress, mores, culture, politics, philosophy, language, religion, than his age. That's historical consciousness. That's saying truth is historically conditioned. You see? So if I want to pick up the Bible, what modernity tells me is I cannot read it as if it were written yesterday in North American English. Wow. I cannot overestimate the shock that that was to the Christian community. The Protestants are way ahead of us Catholics in this historical critical approach to the Bible. But can you imagine that? That now what do I have to do? It's not mere matter of getting an English translation of the Bible, because translation is not what it's about. There's a task required of me now. I have to understand something of the first century world that produced that Bible. Do you see? The Roman Catholic Church fully and clearly and completely accepted the historical critical look at the Bible at the Second Vatican Council in its decree on Revelation. But wow, we're still grappling with this. Still grappling with this. We're going to come back to this point. I think this is a little vague at this point, but you'll notice on your outline that we're going to spend a whole section looking at historical consciousness. Okay, so we'll come back to this point. Let me just finish off postmodernity and on this issue. What is true and important and truth? Here in postmodernity, truth is relative to changing circumstances. Truth is not a matter of looking the way it is in modernity, but it's a matter of judgment, a relative act of judgment. So, for instance, someone says to you, 2 + 2 is 4. Absolutely, unchangingly, and eternally, right? And the response is, it's true relative to base 10. If you change the base, 2 + 2 is not necessarily 4 anymore. That is all I know about modern math. But what you're saying is, truth is not eternal, it's relative. Truth is not unchanging, it's contingent upon knowing the circumstances. You see? It's not absolute, it's mutable. So that if an X-ray technician and I are both looking at an X-ray of my lungs, what I'm seeing is shades of gray. What she is seeing is the relative health or illness of my lungs. I can't make that active judgment because I don't have the relevant set of circumstances to be able to make that judgment more. I can say, oh, it looks a little gray there, it looks a little black there, and, you know. But she can make a more adequate relative active judgment because she knows more of the circumstances. Do you see? Now, if you don't think this makes everybody nervous, this makes everybody very nervous. Because when you say truth is relative to understanding a context, right away you introduce pluralism. You see? Right away you say, well, how in some Asian cultures do you talk about the communion of saints? And how is that received? Do you, as one author says, must the Christian God remain Greek? Do we have to pass through Greek philosophy to pray the creed? Sisters, there's no easy answer to this question. It's a very serious question. But can you see where the controversies come from in the church today? When you're reading things from the point of view of the authoritative source of truth, don't impugn ill will to people who are coming from the sense of truth is known by looking, and we have looked and here it is. To people who have passed to historical consciousness, do you see? But this is the source or the root, I think, of a great deal of what we struggle with. So in postmodernity, remember Sandra Snyder's talking about, is there reality, is there no reality? It's not all relative. Rather, either there is no truth, which some people opt to say, the radical postmoderns opt to say that, or truth is known relatively. In a number of senses. It's known only in community, relatively, relationally, as we come together to make our active judgment more adequate by dialogue and conversation, and it is known relative to the changing circumstances in which we're seeking the truth. You see? I think we need to take a break now. It's a time on our schedule for that.